we're not going to get anything.
Nothing's getting in your way. So
Okay.
that would make it an inconvenience.
That would make it an inconvenience. When you look at convenience or conviction or convenience, convenience is nothing more than the state of being suited to one's personal ease or comfort. And many people, that's the way they worship God. I'm not just talking about in the church, but I'm talking about people as a whole. They worship God out of convenience. It may be Easter Sunday. It may be Christmas. It may be once a month. It may be because they feel that once a month they have to partake of the Lord's Supper, or any number of things. They do it out of convenience, not because they have to. But when you look at conviction, it's the state of being convinced. It's a strong persuasion or belief. You're here tonight because of your conviction for God. You have a strong belief in God, and you want to know more about what God expects of you, so that you can look forward to that day that Jesus comes again. So in religious matters, is your service to God motivated by conviction or convenience? And I think we all would accept the fact that our service is by conviction. But we want to look at some examples, those who acted from conviction, and most of these we know readily. If you turn to Genesis 12th chapter, we're going to look at a couple of verses in Genesis, one in the 12th chapter, one in the 22nd chapter. This is dealing with Abraham. We know that he acted from conviction because you look at verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." Now, how many of us would have the conviction to have someone tell us to go someplace where we've never been before? But yet Abraham had that kind of faith. Turn over to the 22nd chapter, and let's look a little bit more about Abraham. And we'll look at verse 1. It says, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Notice the word that God used there. He said he tested Abraham. What was he doing? He was testing Abraham's conviction, testing Abraham's faith. And Abraham proved to have the conviction that God expected him to have. Look also at Joseph, if you will, in the 39th chapter of Genesis. And we'll look at verse 9, 39th chapter, verse 9. It says, "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" You remember the story of Joseph. You remember the king's wife wanted to
Seduce.
do what?
Seduce.
There's the word I need. Seduce. And what did Joseph do?
Resisted.
He resisted. His conviction was so strong that he literally basically jumped out. She pulled his garment off of him, and he ran. That's how strong his conviction was. Well, we know about Joshua and Caleb in Numbers, the 14th chapter, verses 6 through 10. You remember there were 10 spies sent out to spy the land. And Joshua and Caleb was the only two that came back with a positive report. And because of that, which one was made to take Moses' place? Joshua, right? But both of them had a strong conviction for God. They said that there is no reason why we can't take this land because of the fact that you are providing it to us. And even though there may be some giants in the land, God is with us, and so we can take it. Well, there's another individual. If we go to 2 Samuel, and we look at 2 Samuel. And what we're going to find there is David. 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 24. I don't want kings. There we go. It says, Then the king said to Araunah, No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, nor will I offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. This is the point that where David's conviction was so strong that he was willing to avert a plague by his offering. He bought the threshing floor, and rather than just taking it. And so you see the conviction that David had there. Any other comments or any comments? All right, here's another one. We'll not need to turn there, but Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are individuals who were instructed that they should worship an idol. Right? Did they?
No.
They refused to worship the idol. So what happened? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the furnace. The fire was so hot that the men who threw them into the furnace were literally destroyed. But when the king looked in there, he saw a fourth individual walking with them. They were not harmed by the fire. Why? Because they had a conviction for God. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. And the lions' mouths were closed, where they did not do any harm to Daniel at all. Why? Because Daniel had conviction. He was convinced, and he had a strong persuasion to serve God. Well, there's some others that we can look at. Mordecai and Esther. If you look at Esther, the 3rd chapter, and we look at verse 2. This is Haman's conspiracy against the Jews. And in verse 2 it says, And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. And then we go over to the 4th chapter and we look at verse 16. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. You see the conviction that Mordecai and Esther had here. Well, we go over to Revelation, and we can see another example here of conviction. And that is with Antipas. In Revelation, the 2nd chapter. And looking at verse 10, it says, Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. We look at verse 13 then, and it says, I know your works, and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast to my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. I want you to notice in verse 10 again, he said that Satan would test them. Not tempt them, but test them. Satan tests Christians all the time to see exactly what our conviction is, to see how strong a conviction we have in serving God. We look at Revelation chapter 3 and verse 4, and we read about Sardis there. In verse 4 it says, You have a few names even in Sardis who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. I've always been fascinated about this church here in Sardis, because that would suggest there were, I don't know how many members there were there, but it would suggest that some of the members were not did not have a strong conviction. But God said there's a few of you that do have a strong conviction. And because of your strong conviction, you will wear white raiments. This is the idea behind conviction then. So, any comments?
Does that mean it's iffy if you don't have strong conviction with God? Because if he's saying that these others without the strong conviction is, iffy.
Well, that's a good question, Pat. I mean, I'm not here to answer that question because God's going to be the judge, obviously. But I would say this. I've always made this statement that on the judgment day, I would much prefer God saying to me that I was too conservative than to say I'm too liberal. And I'd much rather be conservative. I'd much rather speak where the Bible speaks and be silent. If I don't have the answer, I'm not going to say something. I'll study and try to get the answer. And so on the judgment day, if he tells me, well, Dale, you could have done some other stuff that you didn't do, but the fact is you did do according to the Scriptures. And for that, there's an old story. I'm going to preach a sermon on April the 6th on the grace of God. Because I have convinced myself that most of us really don't fully understand the grace of God. Oh, yeah, you can give me a definition of the grace of God. But there are things about the grace of God that we don't always understand. We take it for granted. For example, you ever thought about the fact that God gives us the food, but we have to eat it? You ever thought about the fact that God gives us the water, but we have to drink it? You ever thought about the fact that God gives us the air, but we have to breathe it? And all those things is His grace. But His grace doesn't come free to us. His grace requires conviction. His grace requires a complete service to Him. Willingness to make the sacrifices of these many examples that we listed here. Any comments? All right, so.
Hey, Dale.
Yes.
What I was going to say is kind of like whether it's sports or whatever people have affinity for, that you have fair weather Christians as well. And so it got back to your point about test. And are you there for the long haul? Are you there to win the race?
Yeah.
Until the very end?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Good point. And that fair weather Christians, that's a broad picture, if you will, because we can include any number of folks.
Kind of went along with your convenience thing.
Yeah. I mean, there are some reasons why a person may not be able to attend a services. Okay, we accept that. But there are some reasons why people don't attend because they don't want to, because something else has taken precedence. For example, I would venture to say, I don't know anybody here that did this, but Super Bowl Sunday. Did anybody stay home and watch the Super Bowl instead of coming to worship service?
Some people here that did. Not the people in this room.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know anybody from this congregation that did. But that would be my classification of a fair weather Christian. They serve God by convenience rather than by conviction. When we look at all these examples we looked at, we can conclude that these individuals would definitely be there regardless. So, your point is well taken there, Kathy. So when we act from conviction, we take a stand on God's Word and not tradition. We please God and not man. And we receive persecution in this life, but heaven in the next life. And we have plenty of examples of that. We look at the Hebrew writer, all of the problems that the Christians endured there. We look at the apostles and all the afflictions that they suffered. We look at several people in the Old Testament, all the afflictions that they suffered because they served God rather than serving man. And those were people who had convictions. They received the persecution in this life. Even Paul, when he was Saul, convicted the Christians. And if you read Acts chapter 7, Acts chapter 8, what does it tell us? It tells us that Christians were scattered abroad and went everywhere doing what?
Preaching the gospel.
Preaching the Word of God. And so they had a conviction. And so that's what we are today. In this world today, we can definitely suffer persecution. Without getting into politics, if you're a Republican, you don't like the Democrats. If you're a Democrat, you don't like the Republicans. But what is wrong with a free country? Because with this free country, we are able to come together and worship God without fear of persecution. You can't do that in China. You can't do that in any of the Middle Eastern countries. Many of you may not realize it, but you haven't seen Gotham here for a while. You know why he's not here?
Because his dad's here.
Huh?
Because his dad's here.
Yeah, and they'll be here till April. They're not Christians. And he can't let them know. He's trying to work a little bit with them, but he can't let them know that he's a Christian. Because in those countries, they could actually stone or kill their siblings because of the Christian religion. And so for that reason, Gotham can't be here. In fact, whether you know it or not, they even got upset with Donna when she came to services by herself with the baby. But now she had a conviction. And Gotham has a conviction as well. But we need to understand the kind of problems that people go through sometimes and appreciate what they're going through. Whether you know it or not, Donna's going to have to go back to Canada for 2 weeks. And she is going to be able to take the baby with her, which is a good thing. But certainly want to remember Donna and Gotham in your prayers as well. So, when acting from conviction, some stand for the truth at all times. Look at Proverbs, if you will. And we want to look at the 23rd chapter and verse 23. Buy the truth and do not sell it. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who begets a wise child will delight in him. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. So, this is Christians who are acting out of conviction, standing for the truth at all times. But some people attend all services when possible. Now we always look at Hebrews 10:25, and I have a problem with looking at that one verse. And I'll tell you why. We'll read it, and I'll explain why I have a problem with that one verse. Hebrews 10:25 says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Many times we use that scripture to try to tell people that they need to attend worship service. But we don't explain why. But the Hebrew writer does an excellent job of explaining why. Because if you look at the previous verse, in verse 24, he says, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. Well, we can't do that if we're forsaking the assembly. And then verse 26, for if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. You have to read all three of those verses, and not just them, but some of the other verses in Hebrews, the 10th chapter as well, to have a full appreciation of conviction. Any comments?
I've heard it said that verse 25, the day approaching, has some people will say that is the second coming, that when God brings judgment, and it could be, but it certainly seems applicable either way. So
It could, yeah. Any other comments? All right, so some Christians establish a sound church or travel great distances to worship with a sound church. We all go on vacations. When we go on vacations, does that mean we also take a vacation from attending worship service? Or do we look for a congregation that we can worship with? Depends on your conviction. If your conviction is strong enough, you're always going to take time out to find a congregation that you can worship with. Look at Acts the 19th chapter, if you will. In Acts the 19th chapter in verse 9, but when some were hardened and did not believe, but spoke evil of the way before the multitude, he departed from them and withdrew the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. Now this was Paul at Ephesus. We go on and we look at the 20th chapter in verse 6. And this is Paul at Troas. It says, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Why did they stay 7 days? So they could be there to worship on the first day of the week. That's what the very next verse says. Yes?
The only thing that I have not ever quite understood about that, I assume they must have arrived late the prior Sunday, that the meeting must have been over already. If they stayed 7 days, because otherwise they would have been there on that Lord's Day. So
Yeah.
I assume they just didn't arrive in time that day. But
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, what it does say is that they sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, but then in 5 days joined them at Troas. And then they stayed there 7 days. And then it says, now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. Now, so I don't know, your comment is a good question. It is a possibility that they did in fact worship together or something, but that one's not mentioned. But what is mentioned that they stayed there for 7 days? Diane?
It might be because of the Jewish calendar and the way they did their days differently a little bit than.
It could be.
Yeah.
That's something, but you bring up an interesting question there, so I'm going to study that a little bit more, Richard.
well, 7 days means if it's Sunday now, in 7 days it's Sunday again.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. But I'm going to say that's a good question. Any other comments? All right, so let's look at some folks who acted, some preached the whole counsel of God, including the negative, and that's also found in Acts the 20th chapter, beginning at verse 20, if you will. It says, this is Paul giving his farewell speech to the elders at Ephesus. He says, how I kept back nothing that was helpful, but proclaimed it to you and taught you publicly and from house to house. And then we look at verse 27, and here he says, for I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. And so you see the conviction there that the Apostle Paul had. So let's look at some who had acted out of convenience. If we go back to 1 Kings, and I want to look at chapter 12. This is talking about Jeroboam. And we'll look at verses 25 through 29. This is Jeroboam's idolatry, and this is where he divides the nation. He says, then Jeroboam built Shechem, in the mountains of Ephraim, and dwelt there. Also he went out from there and built Peniel, And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. We see a classic example here where a king was designing such a situation to where he made worship a convenience for people. Not only a convenience, but they were worshiping idols instead of worshiping God. We look at our situation today. We have people traveling from Tuttle, from other places. We have people that can't travel, so they participate online, because their desire is to worship with a sound congregation. That's conviction, whereas Jeroboam, it was convenience. We see another example here with the Pharisees and their convenience when we go to Matthew. And we're going to look at the 15th chapter of Matthew. And verses 3 through 9. This is God's commandments versus man's tradition. We can also find this in Mark, the 7th chapter. I didn't put that up there. But in Matthew 15, verses 3 through 9, it says, He answered and said to them, Why do you also transgress the commandments of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, Whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, These people draw near to me with their mouth, and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandment of men. Now we can look at the other examples there as well, but they're all saying basically the same thing. The Pharisees worship God out of convenience rather than conviction. Part of that is because of the fact that they didn't want to lose their prestige in life. Yes, Jack?
I can tell you one example of conviction. Missy called yesterday, and her and Micah, for their 30th anniversary, are going to Europe for 3 weeks. They're going to fly into Spain and go on a cruise from there for 3 weeks. They want to visit Ephesus and Sardis and those places. They're pretty strong Christians.
Yeah. It would be nice to visit those places. I don't know if I'd want to visit it right now, the way things are going over there. But I know some people that have spent quite a bit of time over there touring those places and everything, just so they know a little bit more about what Christ went through.
Yeah, they want to get that feeling.
They want to get that feeling, yeah, and that's a good thing. Any other? Yes, Kathy.
There was a saying that it says obstacles serve a purpose, that they give us a chance to find out how badly we want something.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, and I was thinking about Festus saying, "We'll come back in a more convenient time."
Yeah. He was
on his conscience.
He was wanting a monetary benefit there, and yet I think Paul did reach him to some extent, but he wasn't ready to make that commitment.
That they showed by all the disciples, when you think of their death, as you pointed out many times, that they were willing to go to that very end, whatever it took.
Yeah, good point. All right, here's another good example, Pilate. And we're getting close to what you're talking about.
I thought it went along with what you thought.
Look at Luke, the 23rd chapter. And here we're going to look at verses 20 through 25. Pilate, therefore wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them. But they shouted, saying, Crucify him! Crucify him! Then he said to them the third time, Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified, and the voices of these men and the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that he should be as they requested, or that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. We see examples of that today. Pilate released this murderer for convenience, to satisfy the people rather than to satisfy God. I just saw on the news today where, and I don't remember the name, but someone who murdered someone has been in prison for 3 years and he's up for probation. Now, whether they release him or not, I don't know, but he is eligible for probation.
Depending on what state he's in.
Yeah, and that's sad. I mean, when you look at the Old Testament and you look at what God did not hesitate to bring people to their death who sinned against him. And we become much more lenient today because of the fact that we don't feel that anybody should be put to death. Well, I'm not going to get into that because you may have an opinion about that. It may be for the death penalty, it may be against the death penalty. But God will make that decision, and that's the way we should leave it. So, let's go to Galatians, the 2nd chapter. I want to show you.
He said God will make us a second death.
That's true.
Because everybody's going to die someday.
And everybody will die someday. In fact, you mentioned that. John Vincent and I had an interesting conversation last week. He had done some research. If what percent of the population lived to be past 78? Lived to be 80 years of age?
Now or then?
Huh?
Now or then?
Now.
67%.
That's 78. How about 80?
Hey, less than that.
Jack's 80 years old.
Are you saying he's going to die soon?
No.
Okay then.
I'm saying he is in that small percentage figure.
Yeah, I just wondered, well, what is the percentage?
You got him nervous
Since you
now.
use me as an example, I want to know.
If I remember right, it was 6 to 9% reach 80. But I'd have
I'm already there.
Well, 65% that reach 85 is women, and centenarians, 8 out of 10 is women
yes.
in the population,
Yes.
and not in the total population. But we know what the scriptures teach.
We know women live longer than men.
Now, it said that you were given 10 by
That's
strength of will, 80.
That's right. And so, if you live past 80 years of age, like Vera Blackburn, who's 103.
You just won't let her forget it either.
No. Well,
She needs to be proud of it.
I think that's great that she's been able to live that long. Obviously, God has a purpose for her. And I'll tell you what I think the purpose is. It's because of her strength that Curtis and Cheryl is faithful in their attendance and service here.
Amen.
Vera is the example. And
Well, she's trying to round up those people up there that still around. But
she is.
She's still doing her part.
Yes, she is. So that's good. All right, so I want you to look at Galatians, the 2nd chapter. I'll put it up here. And we're going to look at verses 11 through 14. This is dealing with Peter. This is Peter at Antioch. It says, Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. Now who withstood him? The Apostle Paul, yes. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? Here's an apostle that did commit a sin after he was already preaching the gospel. But here was a situation where, due to convenience, he withdrew himself from the Gentiles for fear of the Jews. And so, even Peter, as strong as he was still human. And he acted from convenience. One last one we'll look at here in convenience is Felix. Look at Acts, the 24th chapter. And verse 25. This is what Kathy was talking about earlier, when he says, now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. This is what Kathy mentioned earlier. It was convenience for Felix. Any comments? All right, so when we act from convenience, we neglect and compromise the truth. We become lukewarm. We become apathetic. We become inconsistent in our service or in our attendance to worship service. And we become worldly. The more we stay away from worship service, the more we stay away from the opportunity to be with brothers and sisters in Christ, the easier it is for us to go back into the world. Because it becomes convenience. Any comments?
He just gave Satan the power that he was after.
True. I want to emphasize this though. Satan's power is limited. Satan cannot do anything that God would not allow him to do. Now I want you to think about that, because if you don't believe that, go to Job. First few chapters. God told him what he could do. And he used the word tested. He didn't use the word tempt. But Satan was limited on what he could do. God in James tells us that we are not tempted with anything greater than what we can handle. Because God is always with us.
Nothing can separate us from God other than us.
And other than us,
As far as.
that's exactly right. So, when we continue to act out of convenience, some will change the work, some will change worship and organization of the local church to meet the desires of the world. Instrumental music is a good example of that. The Lord's Supper on Saturday is a good example of that. And yet we know that the Lord's Supper was on the first day of the week. Yes?
I saw a sign the other day that one of these churches around here has it up on May Street here that there will be Wednesday evening communion service. So,
Yeah.
just comment, but
Yeah. Well, when we were worshiping in Olathe, in Moline, Missouri, we didn't have elders or anything, and we had one young member. He was a good, faithful individual. But he come to the conclusion that if we're going to offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday evenings as well as Sunday morning, then we all should take the Lord's Supper on Sunday morning and Sunday evening. He used the idea that we should all commune together. That's where he was getting that. And I just politely said, before a decision like that is made, we need to do more studying on that subject. Because we don't want to do something that God doesn't want us to do. There are congregations that refuse to offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday nights. Their attitude is if people can't get there on Sunday morning, they won't offer it on Sunday night. Other congregations will offer Lord's Supper on Sunday nights, but they have them go into a separate room. But what we're talking about is convenience here. Instrumental music. Using women to help serve the Lord's Supper. That's taking place in the church today. And you see sign languages taking place now. You see separate things made for Hispanic or Chinese versus English. You see a situation where they don't meet on Sunday nights anymore or Wednesday nights. A long time ago, that was because gas was expensive. But when gas became cheaper, they still didn't change and go back to Sunday night or Wednesday night. We made a mistake here in this congregation when we decided, because of COVID and everything, that we would not meet in the assembly for a period of time. That was a mistake that would never happen again. Because in reality, what we did was convenience rather than conviction. Even though we had online services, every service, and we made sure everybody was available for that. But we have to be careful in our service to God as to whether it's conviction or convenience. The second bell is rung, so I'll just ask if there's any comments that you want to add to what we've been talking about.
Great lesson.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Was that a question or a comment?
Maybe an
It was open-ended.
maybe an exclamation point.
Well, it was a good, but since you had a lot of time to prepare it. You say you had an hour?
Yeah, he called me an hour beforehand. But that was because the nurses were there at that time.